Hey, welcome back to the channel. So I am here with New Testament scholar Robert M. Price. Hi, Mr. Price. How are you today?
Oh, doing great. How about you?
I'm pretty good. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right. Well, I've seen your work online, obviously. I read a couple of your books. I saw you in a documentary going back to 2005, I think. What was it called? The God Who Wasn't There?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Going back a ways. So, yeah, I'm definitely interested in your work. I do want to touch on kind of your story first. You're known for mythicism, and that's your main thing. But I just wanted to get in. I didn't know that you were a pastor. So I wanted to kind of get into your story, how you kind of got out of religion, being a pastor, especially. What convinced you? What set you on that path? Was there a certain thing that kind of like started the process for you, or was it the biggest factor for you? So yeah, if you can just kind of give me the rundown, like how did you come out of religion, basically?
Well, while I was going to Gordon Conwell Seminary in 1977, I had the big break with evangelical Protestantism. I came to believe that the apologetics, the arguments in defense of the accuracy of the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus and so on just did not hold water. I had made arguments for these things for a long time and read a whole lot in conservative literature. But when I began to raise questions about some of the arguments that suddenly seemed to me dubious, I started reading more widely, especially some of the thinkers I had been told I need not read since we had already sufficiently refuted them. I realized there was another side to this I was not hearing, and I came to realize I'm on the wrong team here. And I did not regard that as abandoning religion, though I was up in the air. I remember in the biography of Malcolm X, it says that once he broke with Elijah Muhammad, he was free floating. And I thought, yeah, that's, or in free fall or something. And I thought, yeah, that kind of described me. I didn't really know where I was at, but I didn't think that Christianity or God or anything stood or fell with born again Christianity. I knew the picture was much bigger than that. So I began to study omnivorously all these thinkers like Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann, and others, a whole range of them. Also, innovative Catholic theologians. Sort of mediating English Anglican thinkers like Bishop Temple and others. And I wound up for a few years heavily influenced by Tillich and thinking that, all right, there probably were no miracles. And it's not clear that there is a personal God who answers prayers and so on. That may still be a kind of superstition. So I guess you could say I was moving from what Pascal called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the God of the philosophers. And I thought that still accounts for the good that religion does, even spiritually, that you needn't think of God as Santa Claus to find that God and belief in God still provides a perspective from which to view one's life and to connect with the holy, however it be defined. And so I didn't believe in supernaturalism, but I did believe in kind of idealist, capital I, metaphysical view that there is some sort of a God and that religion is an appropriate response to it. But of course, kind of as Reinhold Niebuhr said, you can and should take it seriously, even if not literally. Well, it was at this point that I became a pastor of a very liberal and open Baptist church in Montclair, New Jersey, where I had begun attending a few years before, with under the preaching of a really dynamic and fascinating man who was originally a Texan, and he had undergone the same sort of metamorphosis I had some years earlier, and he was very biblical, took it all very seriously. He was interested also in philosophy and the arts, and I thought, this guy is great. If he can be a pastor, I guess I can too. And so, in fact, I replaced him when he left for another church, and my mind kept changing to where about half a dozen years later, I was reading really, what would you call it? Well, very critical biblical criticism by some of the 19th century scholars like F.C. Bauer and so forth. And I was also reading Don Cupid and Jacques Derrida and others, and getting into deconstruction, postmodernism. And I wound up in sharing, I guess, Thomas Altizer's view, which he dubbed Christian atheism, that that it was like the story of the incarnation and the atonement. The deeper level of it was something like Buddhism, that said that in our time we recognize the death of God, that is, of a transcendent alien tyrant who rules the world and commands things that are right simply because he says so. I said, this is gone. This God which once dominated Western culture is dead, and the implications imply we're on our own, and that is a kind of demythologized way of understanding the death of Christ. Without getting into questions like, well, was there really a divine nature that took on human flesh? I mean, that's like Bultmann once said, surely this is primitive mythology. But mythology does have deep insights that can't be articulated in any other way. And so I embraced this Christian atheism. I got to know Tom Altizer in his last years, and he wrote an introduction to a book of mine called Preaching Deconstruction. And so I've kind of stuck with that, though I've also been active in secular humanist and atheist groups. But I have my gripes with them because they almost invariably turn out to be progressive liberals, which strikes me as an untenable faith position that ignores the harsh facts of reality just as sure as fundamentalist Christianity did, with a whole different set of questions. So I guess, like Tillich, again, I find myself sort of on the boundary. But to me, that's the growing edge. And I remain open. I study all the religions and write about them. I love religion as a creation of the human spirit. It's a kind of an artistry. And as a humanist, I feel like I can hardly hate something so important to humanity during its whole history. And so I'm kind of an odd duck still. I don't have a systematized theology or philosophy. The world is too big and too ambiguous for that. But I do have a critical but sympathetic approach to these questions that interest me.
Okay, a lot there. I definitely want to dig into a couple of things that you said there. I definitely identify with that mentality overall of not being pigeonholed, not being put into some arbitrary category, thinking for yourself, following the evidence where it leads. Absolutely, and it doesn't matter that the majority of one group you might fall in follows something. If you don't see the validity in it, or then you don't follow that. Yeah, definitely. Are you familiar with? I'm sure you are. Joseph Campbell. Have you read
Oh
his work?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot. Some of what he says from the books that I have that I've read, I kind of think he verges into word salad a little bit, but there is definitely, just the way he says things, it can be complicated. But he says a lot of, I think, pretty profound things that I definitely think resonate. And you kind of reminded me, talking about kind of the kernel of truths that might be found in some mythologies. Definitely. What is it about the, as you call it, the progressive liberal movement that you don't find tenable? Exactly.
Well, they engage in things like what I call political snake handling. They have a commitment to an ideology, and as Hegel was supposed, well, there's this old anecdote about Hegel, whether it's true or not, I don't know, where he got finished expounding some historical development, and one of his students dared to raise his hand and say, "But Herr Hegel, the facts are otherwise." And Hegel said, "Well, then so much worse for the facts." And it seems to me quite apparent that all the stuff about the Green New Deal and the environmentalist cult, it's so obviously a kind of sectarian religion, even setting dates for doomsday. Oh, we got about 10 years until Earth is irreparably polluted. Get out of here. Oh, it's going to be global warming. And before that, it was global cooling and a nuclear winter. And it's like one chicken little hysterical fit after another. Plus, the idea that there is of systemic racism in the United States, that just seems to me obviously ludicrous when you've had a president and then a vice president who are black, and nobody seems to care about this except the people that beat the drum for believing in an imminent race war just so they can bring it about and take advantage of it. And so I think, like everything, I believe like anything Biden says is probably false. I hold him in the same lack of esteem I do Vladimir Putin in Russia. I'm totally cynical about what the government says, and the corruption of it that hides behind apparently noble but obviously groundless ideological extremism. I just am amazed that a lot of my free thought and humanist brothers and sisters appear to be utterly uncritical and just goose step along with the party line because it's the in crowd. If they exercised a modicum of the skepticism they rightly apply to religion, they'd never believe this stuff. But you're a pariah if you don't. And I say that as someone who has been fired at least a couple of times from positions explicitly because of my political views, not my religious ones. So I'm just amazed, and it seems like no dialogue is possible even.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, communication is something that's always key. You have to be able to have free speech is kind of the foundation of just about everything, and you have to be able to communicate. Definitely. There's a book I just read by John McWhorter called Woke Racism, where he basically thinks wokeism is basically a new religion, and he makes a pretty good case for it. Yeah.
They even approximate what fundamentalists call second degree separation. I heard about this way back in the 70s. There are really militant fundamentalists that say that we not only want no fellowship with theological liberals, but if you do, even though you're as orthodox as I am otherwise, I want nothing to do with you either. Well, what do you know? It's the same kind of ultra puritanical intolerance held by people with very different beliefs, but who hold them in exactly the same cultic style.
At the same time, though, for me, you compare them, the left, the worst parts of the left, and their extremism and irrationality with the Republicans, and to me, it's still just, it's not even a discussion, because to me the Republicans are so bad, and a lot of the same ways that the left is, but they're worse, and there's fewer redeeming or more rational elements there.
What do
You
you
know,
think is so objectionable about Republicans?
well, I mean, they don't have a good recent history. I know that the parties switched, just through historical happenstance, some in the '60s or whatnot. But it just seems like they're on the wrong side of just about every issue. I just generally don't really like them. Any of them that I can think of, they just seem like salespeople more so than the Democrats. More of them seem like genuine people, though. I know that they're all politicians. Um, but there are things like, I mean, so I think hard work is your best bet, like as an individual,
Mm,
to get where you want to go.
mm,
However, there are just all kinds of aspects to life and reality that have to do with luck, right? I mean,
mm,
if you think about, I think it was there, Einstein had a quote, or not Einstein, about Einstein, that there was like, just imagine how many Einsteins through history were, tooling away in fields doing, excuse me, doing menial labor, just because they didn't happen to have the opportunity to not be doing menial labor, and you can go all the way back through history, and even in certain circumstances where it's no one's fault. It's just, human beings happen to be where they happen to be, and then that you're born into the family and the place that you are, and the time that you are. And it's just so much luck, it seems to me,
mm,
and I think part of what drives sincere people on the left is the historical context, how bad it's been. But they do, I think, go overboard denying progress that's been made. I'm a big
mm,
fan of Steven Pinker, and
mm,
there has indeed been an immense progress. But I do think we need to understand, like, how we made that progress in order to keep making it, because I don't think things are far from perfect in so many ways, obviously.
mm,
Um, that's my take on it. But I do see problems with the left, some of what you alluded to, definitely.
mm,
Um, but yeah, that's interesting. But getting into your big thing, Mr. Price, which is
mm.
mythicism. Now, I've been away from my channel for a while, so if you could kind of refresh my memory with some of these, like, what are the best arguments for and against mythicism? Um, what convinced you that mythicism is the most tenable position?
Well, for a long time, I had found pretty compelling the three big arguments mythicists have used for a long time. One of them being that the epistles, and as particularly the Pauline epistles, whoever they were written by, and I'm not even sure we know that. I mean, even conventional scholars now say that only 7 of the 13 with Paul's name on them really go back to him, but I tend to go along with an older, radical generation of scholars that use the same criteria to suggest that none of these are written by one single person, and they're filled with anachronisms and so on that would imply a later date than we usually place Paul at. But nonetheless, here is here are writings from a kind of Christianity who seem to be unaware that there was a historical Jesus, that do not mention Jesus ever having been an itinerant prophet, that only dubiously have allusions to a couple of gospel quotes, which are not even claimed to be such. There's no reference in Paul to Jesus ever doing any miracles, and the few little bits that are often cited as signs that the writer knew of things like the Last Supper or the betrayal of Jesus and so on, they seem to be slanted interpretations of very ambiguous, equivocal texts, or non-mythicist scholars have made, independently, pretty good arguments that these are interpolations, that they weren't even in the original letter. So it's so dubious that in the main, it appears that the epistles, whoever wrote them and whenever, were unaware of this whole tradition of the gospel Jesus. And that implies to me that, like, there's a big principle in historical criticism. If you have two versions of a story, for instance, and one is more spectacular than the other, you have to infer that the less spectacular is closer to historical reality. I mean, we don't know. We don't have a time machine to go back and find out, but it stands to reason that people might not be satisfied with a more mundane story and would have hyped it up in the telling. Whereas it's a little hard to imagine the reverse, that the original was really spectacular and that people whittled it away. And like in the Gospels, did John was the prophet Elijah on hand to herald Jesus? The rabbis thought he would precede the coming of the Messiah, but apparently not. And so in the Transfiguration story, you have stitched together two contradictory attempts to escape from the dilemma. One of them says, well, John the Baptist did appear, sort of. I'm sorry, Elijah did appear. He was John the Baptist. Oh, so that's what the prophecy meant, huh? And then the other one says, oh, no, Elijah himself appeared along with Moses on top of the Mount of Transfiguration. You would never say the John the Baptist thing if you knew the Transfiguration one was the truth. So it looks like it's been hopped up. Well, in the same way, if you compare the epistles, which speak of a heavenly Christ and so forth, with the gospel stories that are chock full of miracles, exorcisms, healings, how come these other people didn't know anything about that? Maybe because it hadn't happened. So that was one of them. The second biggie is, why is Jesus, if he was the miracle working Superman that the Gospels portray him as, and so popular, people were coming to him to be healed from all over the landscape, why do contemporary historians not mention him? Well, people like to point to a passage in Josephus's Antiquities where he seems to mention Jesus but says he was the Christ, which is a little odd since Josephus had his life spared by saying that the Roman Emperor Vespasian was the Christ. It just seems like another one of these phony inserts. And other than that, like, why do they not refer to Jesus and his miracles? Well, some scholars say, oh, well, you see, that's because Jesus was hyped up. All these miracles, granted, they're legends, they're exaggerations, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a rabbi named Jesus who was executed. Well, that to me, I'm a big comic book superhero fan, and that to me sounds like somebody in the future wondering if there was a historical Superman. And so somebody is saying, well, yeah, now I admit, could he really leap tall buildings in a single bound? No, obviously that's a legend. Was he faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive? No, obviously not. We're adults here. But there was a historical Superman. When you penetrate all the fog of exaggeration, he was Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. Wait a minute. Can you even imagine somebody taking this guy and making him into Superman? No. Either there was a Superman who did have these powers, or he's a fictional character.
Could you imagine like a middle way? Could you imagine kind of like a compromise there, where maybe not a Superman, but somebody that was very charismatic, that maybe did something or a couple of things that were pretty remarkable. They got a large following, and then some legends grew up around that might have kernels of truth. I mean, do you not find that more intuitively plausible?
even that, though, is such a severe reduction. Like, Jesus doesn't just heal a couple of people. The Gospels have him healing every single person in vast crowds. He casts out demons, and though the disciples fail at this a couple of times, he never does. It's like this is a job for Superman. You're obviously dealing with legends like this, it seems to me. And if you say, well, he was like Catherine Coleman, he was a faith healer and maybe healed a couple of people psychosomatically, you're really back to Clark Kent. It's possible, but it's you've so reduced the character. It's just like when people say, well, was there a Merlin the magician, like in the King Arthur tales? Well, there was an ancient Welsh poet named Myrddin. Maybe he gave rise to the story of Merlin. Well, look, if it was originally just a poet, Myrddin, there was no Merlin the magician. The one is not the same as the other. Popeye, the sailor man, he was actually based on an ugly looking cuss who was in the Navy. We know who he was, we know his name and all that. But he didn't get super strength from eating stinking spinach. There was no Bluto, no olive oil. He couldn't do all these miraculous feats. Was there a historical Popeye? Well, yeah, if you want to call him that. Was there a Sherlock Holmes? No, but Arthur Conan Doyle was sort of inspired by a famous detective, but that doesn't make him Sherlock Holmes. So it seems to me it's a desperate attempt at anchoring Jesus in, I call these theories, Jesus didn't exist, but somebody else did. Is that good enough? So those, and then another major one of the old arguments that I find pretty compelling is that there were several dying and rising savior gods in the ancient world, some predating Christianity, maybe all of them actually, but some demonstrably. And why should we, again, going back to my beloved comic books, to insist that that Jesus was the one where it really happened? This is like saying, all those superheroes, Captain Marvel, the Martian Manhunter, Green Lantern, they didn't exist. They're fictions, but Superman, now he really existed. Why would you say that? I mean, he's obviously cut from the same cloth as the other ones. It's the ultimate case of special pleading. And so finally, the thing on top of that, on those are the three big arguments, and I think they're pretty good. I did a study over some months of every book I could find where a scholar argued that this or that story in the Gospels looked like a rewrite of some story of Elijah, Elisha, David, Joshua, Moses, etc. in the Old Testament, multiplying food and stilling the storm, etc. And I knew there were a couple of those, but I was amazed that some of the arguments seemed inconclusive to me. But even what was left, it made it that really pushed me over the edge. I thought, wait a second. It looks like virtually every gospel story is a rewrite of an Old Testament story. So what is more likely, that there was a guy that actually multiplied food, that walked on water, changed water into wine, etc., or that people decided to rewrite well-known legendary stories? So I wind up saying it's possible there was a historical Jesus. There's no way to know that he wasn't, and maybe somebody will find good evidence someday. I don't think it's preferable for there not to be a historical Jesus, but it seems to me that the burden of proof is on anyone that would say there was. If they say there could have been, right, of course, but that's not quite the same thing as saying, oh yeah, there was one.
Yeah, I mean, I know there are all kinds of problems with the Jesus story, and I've read Carrier's work on this too. His big book, and he's got a lot of good points. I don't know. Part of it, though, for me is it's a On the other side, that's kind of compelling is the following that was started. The movement
Say
of
again,
Christianity.
it was the what?
What I find compelling is a little bit is the movement that was started, right? Gathering that momentum, that following, even though it took a few hundred years to really get started. Um, the fact that we have a world religion, I don't know, it seems a little more plausible, at least intuitively, that there was some kernel of a person or something there, rather than completely, mythical.
Well, do you think there had to have been a historical Krishna or Mithras? Because
No,
they're sort of analogous figures, and nobody
it could have
thinks they
been
existed. I
right,
mean,
could have been,
and I
but
think that the evidence is pretty lame for a historical Moses or Buddha. They seem to be just
yeah,
names given to growing contradictory bodies of teaching and stories.
yeah.
So there could have been.
Don't most scholars kind of reject the Moses historicity at this point?
That's
They
right,
don't.
but that's only happened pretty much within our lifetime. For a long time, you had what Niels Peter Lemke calls rationalistic paraphrase. People would say that, well, okay, again, that not necessarily all that stuff in the Pentateuch happened, but as much of it as you could imagine happening in the real world, okay, maybe that's what happened, but more close scrutiny of these traditions show that they've grown in the telling, and that some of them probably did not even feature Moses originally, and that he's simply invoked as a warrant for the authority of this or that law or ceremony. And that, especially since you've got several different law codes crammed together in the Pentateuch, and they don't all even agree on the same matters. Like, what should you do? Should you sacrifice your firstborn infant, or should you redeem him by an animal instead? Uh, Divorce or no divorce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like somebody just decided to throw them all together and say, well, we got to try to obey them because God told Moses, just like the Babylonians said, Shamash told King Hammurabi to give these commandments to everybody, or the Greeks, Apollo gave us these commandments. And there's no real biographical information about Moses, even in the Bible. Most of it seems to be copied from the stories of Jacob. And so and as of Thomas L. Thompson, who really created a revolution and inaugurated what is now called minimalism. He argued that all of these Pentateuchal figures and David and Solomon and other ones never existed, or at least there is no evidence where there would have to be evidence. Like, you can look at archaeology and find that no matter which possible route you take out of Egypt to Canaan, there is no evidence using infrared heat scans that have revealed caravan routes in the Sinai, in the Arabian desert. There is no evidence for this massive exodus of people. There is no evidence for a Temple of Solomon or a Palace of David. What happened? Did God send angels with big moving equipment and vacuum cleaners to get rid of it all, like a ticker tape parade in New York City? That's like saying Satan planted phony dinosaur bones to throw us off the track. And
Yeah.
it just seems like there's there's no evidence where you would have to have evidence, and that kind of means we're dealing with sacred fiction. So and now this is the mainstream view of critical scholars. It's only fundamentalists who insist, oh yeah, Moses really did exist and did this stuff. They're not taken seriously, and rightly so.
But why does the mainstream consensus still argue for the historicity of Jesus, though?
I
The,
think
the,
it's the same thing. It's just that they have more loyalty for, well, I don't mean this the way it's going to sound initially, but they were all brought up in either evangelical or traditional leaning mainstream Christian groups. And even if, like Bart Ehrman, they don't believe in it anymore, their studies were in that framework, and they've not found occasion to really take a second look at them. They can't think, in my opinion, studying their work, it seems to me that they just cannot think out of the box they inherited. Now, there's some who may actually have more radical beliefs, but know that they would lose their teaching position. But I never accuse any individual of that. I'm not sure anybody is intimidated.
I know that Ehrman talks about. I know that Ehrman talks about James, the brother of Jesus, a lot.
Yeah, there's another one where non-mythicists have suggested that the sole passage in Galatians is an interpolation, partly because Irenaeus, who was reading copies of Galatians before any that survive, is talking about whether Marcion was right, that Paul was independent of the Jerusalem apostles. And there is one, in Galatians, as we read it, there are two journeys of Paul to Jerusalem. The second one is where they're debating the necessity of circumcision. But the first one, earlier, he says that he met none of the apostles except Cephas and James, the Lord's brother. Then it says, some years later, I went to Jerusalem again. No James mentioned that time. Well, Irenaeus, arguing against Marcion, Irenaeus, who believed that Paul was really kind of subordinate to the Jerusalem apostles, doesn't quote the one that would where Paul says, I came to lay my gospel before those reputed to be pillars, lest I had run in vain. Like, Marcion, that alone would refute Marcion's idea of Paul's independence. Well, Irenaeus doesn't quote that when he's arguing that no, Paul was subordinate to them. And then when he does mention the other one, the circumcision debate, he doesn't refer to it as Paul going again. It's just when Paul went to Jerusalem. Well, again, a non-mythicist who's not even thinking of the possibility that Jesus might have been a myth said, this kind of looks like that in Irenaeus's day, this passage did not appear in Galatians, but that somebody added it as a refutation of Marcionism. And that wouldn't be the only case. Just to illustrate what I mean, and I'll stop with this. Earlier in Galatians, he says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman. Wait a minute, you've got to stipulate that the guy was born? Why would you say that? Well, one thing about President Obama, he was born, obviously. But if you're attacking Marcion, you might say that, because he believed Jesus wasn't born. He descended from heaven as an adult. So there are things that kind of look like they would make sense if you're arguing against Marcion, and like Bart Ehrman says in another book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. Later, where we do have manuscripts to consult, you can tell that occasionally the church fathers actually rewrote the text to yank the rug out from under the heretics. I think that's what's happened here. And so that's it. If your case rests on Jesus having a flesh and blood brother, and I understand the inference there, but if that's it, that's a pretty weak read. The originality of the text is really up for grabs. You can't appeal to it as evidence to settle a debate if it itself is the subject of debate. And that's what they're doing.
What is some of the good evidence, just a couple of examples briefly, of some of the pre-Christian dying and rising, gods? When I learned about all this many years ago, I was blown away by it. I had no idea, and I think most people don't have any idea. What are like two key pieces of evidence for two of those? Like, I know Inanna, there's some others.
Mm-hmm. Osiris is a great one. And keep in mind, Osiris religion was known and probably practiced in Canaan for a millennium before the Bible history starts, because Egypt ruled Canaan in the third millennium BC. So they would certainly have known about Osiris. And it seems to me that Joseph is already a Hebrew retelling of Osiris. But in any case, the ancient pyramid texts, written many centuries before Christianity, speak of the death and resurrection of Osiris, and how we can be raised from the dead in the future as well because of it. That's even like Christian soteriology. The worshippers of Osiris, since he was a grain god, they had sacrament meals of wine or beer, since he was the god of grain and of grapes. That was his blood, and they ate bread, grain god again, because that was his body. And so there's a big one. But then you've also got Baal. We got a whole mess of Canaanite Ugaritic texts that give us amazingly parallel myths to those of the Old Testament, but this too, because Baal is fighting the death monster Mot and the sea monster Yam, and he is killed, but his his sister Anat she goes to the netherworld to bail him out, and no pun intended, and does bring him back, and so they proclaim Baal lives, and he then becomes co with his father El. And also even Osiris, is his body is sought by his wives, the sisters Nephthys and Isis, who raise him from the dead. Well, you've got the holy women of the Gospels going to anoint the body of Jesus and so on. I mean, there's several parallels, but then you've also got Tammuz and Ishtar, or Dumuzi and Inanna, as you say, Aphrodite and Adonis, Cybele and Attis. There are even Hercules myths where he dies and rises from the dead. And then more contemporary stories where they borrow those motifs, so that Julius Caesar is modeled on the ascension of Romulus and so forth. And then he appears afterward to his disciples and gives them a great commission. I mean, there's a great book called Jesus Deus by David Litwa, who shows a huge number of these motifs in pre-Christian sources. And it's just absurd to me when apologists say, well, really, these things were counterfeits fabricated by the devil in advance of the coming of Jesus, just to trip people up, so that when
That's what
they
early Christian apologists said that.
Hmm?
Even going back to the earliest Christian apologists said that.
Yeah, and
Like
some
Justin Martyr.
say that.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Like Justin Martyr, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bingo. Yeah. I believe Tertullian and some other ones too. And the funny thing about that is actually what modern apologists prefer is to say, well, in the face of the evidence, these rival versions, they must have been later than Jesus. They must have been pagan copies. But not only do we have things that are datably much earlier, with Attis and Baal and Dionysus.
Datably by what methods? I know some of this stuff has been like carbon dated and by other means, and some of it's just kind of you can put things
in authors who are known to have existed, like the Dionysus stories, including in Euripides the Bacchae and very many other myths. There are at least a couple of different versions of his resurrection. And the Ugaritic texts about Baal, they go back 1,000 years before Christianity, as do, I believe, the pyramid texts. I think there may be more than a millennium in those. And there are some that are just a little bit earlier, but like with Attis, who was raised from the dead uh, there was a big debate for a long time about that. But then there was a discovery of pottery shards that depicted the resurrected Attis, and these were BC, not AD. Well, that kind of settled that one. And so there's, you don't even need to resort to carbon dating for this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
but the funny thing is, if you challenge that and say, oh, they must have been later, you're not seeing what the original early Christian apologists did, namely that if they're saying the Osiris, Tammuz, Baal, etc. versions were counterfeits by the devil in advance, you're admitting that those are earlier. No sane apologist would argue that way if he knew that the Christian version was the oldest. It was like common knowledge that this was a new message, and that the older ones, like Justin, you mentioned, he says, "Now I don't know why you guys think it's so ridiculous for us to say that our Savior was born of a virgin and did this and that. You say that all the time about your deities." Yeah, that's right. And you can say, "Well, okay, this was the only time it happened." Like C.S. Lewis, myth became fact. That's another one that is fatal, it seems to me. You would only say that, well, really God kind of allowed a sort of Jungian collective unconscious to create these prototypes, like a Christian typology, that Joseph was really a prototype for Jesus, who was the antitype. I'm not even sure what the point of that is, but that's what you would be saying. Osiris was the type, and Jesus fulfilled it historically. That's like what? That is not an apologetics argument. That only makes sense if you are already a Christian. It's not an argument for the priority or the sole reality of the Jesus version. Instead, you're saying, well, what am I as a Christian to make of this? It's not a reason to be a Christian. That irony strikes me in 1 Corinthians 15, where people can see the liturgical, creedal nature of verses 3 through 11. He died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, was buried, rose from the dead in accordance with the scriptures, etc., etc. He appealed to this one, he appeared to this one, and then to that one, and then to the other one. This has a kind of poetic, metered structure that indicates it was like the Apostles' Creed or something. And they say, aha, this must be early evidence that goes back to the eyewitnesses. This is not evidence at all. A creed is not evidence for something. It is an affirmation of something for which you might or might not have evidence. It's just a fundamental mistake, and it seems obvious to me that apologists are spin doctors. They really are like trying to make Biden look good as the candidate. It's like you got your work cut out for you there. You wanted to just stop spinning.
Right. Yeah, I know these conversations could go on all day. It's definitely fascinating. Just to close though,
Especially with a big mouth like me.
Well, you're knowledgeable. So I read your book. I forget the title, but it's about Bill O'Reilly, about how he kind of misrepresented things with Jesus.
Killing history.
Yeah, there you go. Now, when you see on the History Channel at Easter time, the few times they actually still have historical content, it's about Jesus pretty much. And on CNN, maybe, what are the two biggest kind of mistakes or falsehoods that they perpetuate on those kind of popular Jesus, documentaries?
Well, one is thinking that the Gospels are more historically accurate than they are, and ignoring the plain marks of legend. Another is the uncritical selection of supposed experts they talk with and then selectively quoting what they say.
I
Because
noticed
you
that.
would read, you would hear one of these things. What was it called? John Dominic Crossan was on it. Various other ones. They'll say things like that that they believe about the historical Jesus. But if you believe that Crossan thought there was really a resurrection, which you probably would believe based on this show, you'd be totally wrong, because just quote bits and pieces that seem to maybe elucidate elements of the standard story. I remember Peter Jennings on his historical Jesus show was interviewing a monk who was a tour guide to the holy places in Jerusalem, like the Garden of Gethsemane. Oh, this is where Jesus did this and that. This guy has no way of knowing that's the truth. They're just uncritical, and they're just
Right.
supporting it. Or, oh boy, every Easter you hear archaeologists may have found the home of Simon Peter or his fishing boat. No, they didn't. If you look
Yeah.
into it, as somebody suggested it, but there was no real evidence, as if there was only one fishing boat in Capernaum, so must have been Pete's. It's just utterly uncritical for ratings, and
Right.
it's just a step above these sickening Mary and Joseph soap operas or rom-coms they have at Christmas time. We know nothing about these people, even if they did exist, but you'd never know that from the boob tube.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure you could go on at length on that topic also. There's probably a lot more to say. But yeah, I guess we'll wrap up here. Mr. Price, again, thank you so much for being on. I enjoy your work. And yeah, we really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Foresight paradigm, fine. A foresight paradigm, foresight paradigm, you fine. A foresight paradigm, I fight for sight.